In this video, we'll learn about function expressions. So far, we've used function declaration, but there's another way to define functions by treating them as expression and assigning them to variables. We'll also explore anonymous function and how they're commonly used as callbacks. A function expression defines a function as part of an expression, typically by assigning it to a variable. Let's look at an example. So here, the function is named total, but we assign it to the variable sum. To call it, we use sum, not total. The name total is only accessible inside the function itself. Let me explain how this is different from an example that you've seen in a previous video. Earlier, we had a case like this. We had a function declaration, and then we could also assign that function to a variable. Now what you can do is you can either call the function using its own name or call it with the variable that was referencing it. So let's call this. Notice that both of them in this case, they work. Now, the example that I'm presenting right now is different in a sense that I'm not defining function total and then assigning it to sum. I'm using the function declaration and treating it like an expression. So it comes after the assignment operator. Now, if you run this code, you're going to see that it says total does not exist. So you can't use total anymore. Now you must use sum to call this function. Here we go. Now what you can do is, in fact, you can drop the name altogether. So you can take total out. And this is a more common way of using function expressions. When you write code like this, then this function that has no name is called an anonymous function. So in a sense, this is cleaner. No extra name to worry about. The function keyword is followed directly by parameters. We call it using the variable name sum. Anonymous functions are perfect when you only need the function in one place or for a limited scope. Let's look at one of the issues with anonymous functions, and that's because they are anonymous or they don't have a name. They are not able to reference themselves, to refer to themselves, which means that you're not going to be able to use them for recursion. So here's an example to showcase this. The first version here, let me run this first. The first version uses the variable name fact for recursion. You can see it here. It doesn't have a name to refer to itself. The second one uses the named function here, the internal name of the function f. So both of these work, but the name version is safer because the internal name can be accidentally reassigned. For most cases though, anonymous functions are sufficient and more concise. So let's look at an example where it is common and safe to use anonymous functions. And that's when you pass them to other function, to higher order function. Usually this is called a callback function. So let's take a look at an example to understand how this works. So I have an array of numbers, and arrays in JavaScript have a lot of utility functions or methods that come with them. One of them is called filter. And we will explore the array functions in a future lesson. But let me tell you what filter does. So the filter takes a function as an argument. Now that's something that you typically can do in, let's say, a programming language like Java, right? But here you have a function that itself takes another function as an argument. And to better show this to you, I can take this function out and define it here. So let's give this a name, function, let's call it myFilter. And then you can pass this here to filter. So what myFilter does, or perhaps a better name for it would have been isEven, right? So what the filter operation does is that it will call this function that you provided for every element, every number in the numbers array. And if it returns true, it will let that number pass through the filter. If it returns false, it will block that number and filter it out. So effectively what happens is that if I run this code, I'm going to end up with even values in the evens variable. So if I were to use isEven in other cases, in other places, which probably I would be using, this is a helpful function, then it makes more sense to us to define it as I did here. But let's suppose that isEven was not going to be used in any other case other than in here for the argument of filter. Then it makes more sense to us to, rather than declaring it as I did here, to use a function expression. So inline it basically where the argument is expected. And since this is just the argument, right, we are not going to be using this function outside of this context, we don't really need to give it a name either. There we go. So this is a very good place, a good example of where anonymous functions are going to be useful. So this still works the same as before. All right, we've learned about function expressions, which is defining functions as values assigned to variables. Anonymous functions are function expressions without names. They're perfect for callbacks and short-lived functions. When you need recursion with anonymous functions, either reference the variable or use a name function expression. This pattern of passing anonymous function as callback is very popular, and it's a fundamental one for JavaScript developers. You're going to be seeing this everywhere in real code.